this is Storytelling for the Planet, an introduction to environmental reporting. And the one thing to know to begin with is that in journalism, journalism in general is intended for speed reporting. It's intended to do things pretty fast. So when we ask students to do reporting, often for the first time you do it, it seems like a really long process, but it's not intended to be a long process. It's intended, you find an idea, you find people to talk to, you do some research, and then you write a story. And in nonfiction reporting, stories tend to have some pretty clear formats. I like to think of it as like movies. We see the same movies over and over and over again, and some of them are amazing, even though they still follow the same basic formula. And I'll show you why, what really kind of makes the difference with that. So what's an environmental story? What's a news story? A news story is just something that's happening, right? So what's an environmental story? An environmental story is about air, water, land, food, the oceans, those things that are really basic to us. And I think one of the problems with a lot of environmental stories is that the writers lose that sense. And they start talking about laws, and they start talking about chemistry, and they start talking about all these things, and they lose sight of the real basics, which is it's about the air we breathe, the water we drink, the land we live on, the food we grow, and the planet and what we've done with it. It's about our planet and what's around us. And so at the heart of environmental stories, when you keep that in mind, they're totally relevant to everyone around us, because we all breathe and drink and eat, and we're all living on the same planet. So what stories are worth telling? Oh, and I wanted to show you, hold on, this in my feed here, if I can, oops, hold on. Oops, let me get back to this for a second. I just wanted to show you, if I can get to my link, what I saw on my news feed this morning. Oops, I'm just having trouble with my Zoom is creating too big a screen for me. This was my feed this morning, my Google feed, which is the first thing I check in the morning. And under the environment, we have, will using more biofuels be good for the environment? Experts square off. Environmental advocates express frustration over Biden regulation delays. Depleted under Trump, a traumatized EPA struggles with its mission. France to take legal action over nightmare plastic pellet spill. Some books, a prominent environmental group suing the German government. And you know what? I didn't feel like clicking on any of these stories. They just weren't compelling to me. They weren't about where I'm living and what's happening around me. And so I wanted to show that to you because one of the problems with getting climate change action is getting people to care. And I think many stories and much of journalism does the opposite. It turns us away. And so we have to be really careful about when telling stories that we're telling stories that people care about. At News Decoder, we have a process we call pitch, reporting, draft, and revision. And pitching is basically finding the story. And then people pitch these stories to us. Some stories that are pitched to us are great and some are really boring, just like I showed you. So how do you find a good story? Which ones are worth telling? And here's the key. They identify something happening or someone doing something. But let me go back. It's something happening with the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat. That's the key. They're not about laws. Laws are the news angle. It's what's happening, but the point of the law is how is it going to change the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, the animals around us, et cetera, et cetera. So here's an activity. What types of things can you name? Can you name anything that might be happening just in general, regarding the air we breathe, water around us, land we live on, or the food we grow and eat that you know of? The winters are getting worse, okay? In California, we went from no water to too much water. More extreme weather events. Those are good ones. Yeah. There's even, more basic ones than that. Oh, air pollution is increasing. Good. I just read something about a chemical in the water. And it was really quite disturbing. Air pollution is increasing. Okay, good. So, so now can you think of something happening near you? So I'm looking for something more specific, something happening near you, or someone doing something. So something happening near, or someone specific doing something, again, regarding the air we breathe, water around us, land we live on, or the food we grow and eat. And again, we want to type this into the chat. So the question is, how aware are we of these things right around us? Volunteering, planting mini forests, good. Okay, I have in my area, ocean cleanup is a really big one. People are working to clean up the oceans and the beaches. More locally grown fruits and vegetables, good. Yeah, I generally gave up meat 2 years ago because of a story I read. Student societies raising awareness and creating dialogue about climate change, good. Lake and pond cleaning, good. These are all good things. These are actions that are happening that people can actually understand and connect to. So reporting the story. So once you find an idea, and again, the idea is the thing that's happening around you, or the person that's doing something that again is around you. Stories start local. It's hard to report and write a really big story, and it's hard for people to grasp really big stories. The best stories are small stories that end up having big meaning. And so there's 3 types of nonfiction stories. Remember, I was talking about formulas and how journalism in general is meant for quick stories. We hear about, reporters spending years on a story, but not most of them. Most of them are fairly quick, and they have certain formulas to them. And there's 3 basic types of nonfiction stories. I found that almost all nonfiction stories fall into one of these 3. And that's a news story. Something happened, is happening, will happen. So there's that law that's being passed, right? There's there's a weather event that has happened. There's a dam that's being taken down. Here where I am, they're taking down this huge dam, and it's I can't even imagine how that's going to happen. A trend story, which is a pattern of the same thing happening. It could be in a small area. A whole bunch of people are starting to wear, I don't know, black t-shirts. That's a pattern of the same thing happening. Or you could have worldwide, everyone's playing the same video game. It could be in a small area. It could be in a really big area. And then a profile. Someone is doing something worth knowing about. Almost all stories fall into this: news story, trend story, or a profile. So again, if you're looking for a news story, something has happened, is happening, or will happen, and that's what you're focusing in on. And if you're doing a profile, you're focusing in on one person. And then a trend story is a pattern of a whole bunch of things happening, and whether it's increasing or decreasing. So now, just going to break this up a little bit, because a 2021 survey of 10,000 young people, so this was a really big survey across borders, and it found that 60% were very or extremely worried about climate change. More than 50% felt sad, anxious, angry, powerless, helpless, and guilty. Again, this is over climate change. And more than 45% said those concerns negatively affected their daily life and functioning. This is connected to that news feed I showed you, which really, the daily stories coming out are about problems and about our failure to solve these problems. And young people are feeling that the adults in the room don't know what the heck they're doing, and there's no hope. So environmental news stories and trend stories are making us crazy. They're literally making us crazy. And so if you're wanting to get people engaged in climate change, you can't turn them away. You have to bring them in. And the way to bring them in is to inspire them, and you inspire people through solutions. So a story worth telling is about solutions to our climate problems, and it's about the people finding these solutions. That's what a good story is. So when you go back to the pitch, the finding the story, what you're looking for is people who have some kind of solution, and they can be really small ones. Because if you have 1 billion people doing a small solution, you have a big effect. If you have 1 billion people calling for change, you're going to get change. And it's what they're doing. So you find the solutions, you find the people, and then you tell the story about what they're doing. And if you find a good story and you find a good person to tell it, these stories tend to write themselves. They're very easy to do. So 2 famous examples. Wangari Maathai, she founded the Green Belt movement that planted over 51 million trees in Kenya, ended up winning the Nobel Prize. She's my personal hero. And of course, Greta Thunberg, who galvanized the entire world youth movement on climate change, just by being quietly insistent. And we all know Greta. Many people know Wangari. The less famous examples are, I can't even pronounce this name, so if any of you speak Portuguese, Maxine dos Santos Saraiva, a climate activist and community leader in the Amazon, organizes community actions directed at government actors, agribusiness, and the public. Again, these are the stories that did catch my attention in my newsfeed. A team of students in Calgary developed an energy plant with carbon capture technology to recycling incineration waste. And then one of you mentioned in Paris, the volunteers who are creating pocket forests to slow climate change. Again, that's a little story, but if you have in every city people creating pocket forests, you're going to have a big change. And these are good stories. These are stories people want to read. So we have a storytelling challenge. This goes back to what Maria was talking about with our Writings on the Wall project. We partnered with the Climate Academy in Brussels and Global Youth and News Media, a nonprofit organization in Paris, to do a Writings on the Wall project where we're getting schools throughout the world to paint murals to raise awareness of climate change, having youth do this. And on our part at News Decoder, we're hosting a storytelling competition. We're calling it a challenge because we like the idea of the viral challenge. And it's for teenage journalists aged 13 to 19. So if you are a teenage journalist aged 13 to 19, or if you know any, particularly if you know any schools who might be interested in this, we're looking for profiles, again, finding the people that are trying to solve this problem. We're looking for original nonfiction stories in English as text, a podcast, a video, or multimedia. Because one thing I didn't talk about is that we tend to think about stories as written, but they can be in all kinds of forms. You know, movies are great ways of telling stories. Videos, you know, my daughter watches videos constantly. My students where I teach watch YouTube videos constantly, TikTok videos. They can be in podcasts, which is now my favorite form of storytelling consumption. I love listening to podcasts. They can be in any kind of form. I've seen stories told through graphic novel form, through cartoons, which I actually love. So they can be anything. And then the winners get a cash prize plus coaching and publication on News Decoder. We want one of the things that we do at News Decoder is we publish youth stories found and reported by high school students and university students. And so the winners of our storytelling challenge are going to get coaching from us for publication. And then again, this is organized by us and Global Youth and News Media. And we've got a March 1st deadline. So there's quite a lot of time to do this. For anyone who hasn't done a profile story, the challenge is finding the person, and the challenge is connecting to the person, and the challenge is getting that person who is probably an amazingly busy person, because people who are problem solvers find themselves quite busy all the time. The challenge is getting them to give you some time, and really that's the biggest challenge of the whole process. Once you can sit down with someone, once you can walk with someone as they're doing their project, as they're meeting with people and talking to people, getting the information is really easy, because these people tend to be very interesting and very passionate, and passionate people like telling their story. And then, as I said, these stories tend to write themselves, because an interesting person will make an interesting story. It's very difficult to take an interesting person and make a boring story about that person. So the challenge is, again, finding somebody in your area. And I think now that there is not a place on the planet where there is not someone who is working on climate change in some way. We've gotten to the point where pretty much everywhere we understand the problems. Any thoughts? Oh, we have this little, what do you call that, QR code for people who want some more information. Does anyone have any thoughts or questions on this? Is there anything I've missed? No thoughts or questions? Someone shoot me a question.
I had a question for those in the room, and we've had a couple more join, who might be brand new to storytelling. I know there was at least one person who'd never written a nonfiction story. Can you go a little bit deeper into what is involved in a pitch? What are the elements somebody should think about when they want to pitch a story? Maybe they found someone in their community who's doing something great. How do you put that together to send to a publication?
Being specific and being local and starting small is really important. People think when they're starting to do stories for the first time, they're thinking big is better, but big is not better. You know, there's a famous New York Times columnist, Nicholas Kristof, and he writes about genocide. And he said it's really difficult to get people to care about genocide, which you think, wow, that's harsh. And he said the reason is that psychologically people can't process big. They process small. And so people can't process, their brains can't handle the idea of thousands of people getting killed. But if you write a story about one person who was killed, it goes viral. They can't process the idea of lots of children who aren't getting education. But if you do a story on one child who can't get an education, it goes viral. And so you want to start with what's around you. The other thing is that people new to storytelling, they're looking over here and they're looking over there and they're looking so far away and so vague, and they miss the thing that's right in front of their face, you know? And so, so I say, again, keep it nearby, keep it to a particular person or a particular project. And that's what makes a really good pitch. Out of that, you can talk about, once you're talking to that person, or once you're doing your research on that one thing, you can expand the story outward to show how there's people doing pocket forests elsewhere, that there's whole governments that are funding these types of tree planting, park creation programs. But you don't want to start with the government program because people don't care about government programs. They have a hard time processing that. What they care about is one person, a baker maybe, you know, a guy who has a storefront, who has decided to take his sidewalk and create a little parklet for the planet, you know, a restaurant that has decided to only do vegetarian cuisine for the planet. Things like that, people sacrificing, people building, and people protesting, because protests are inspiring when people get together to do these things. But again, think about with protests, the stories that have been really compelling, not a story about a massive protest, a story about Greta Thunberg, one woman protesting. So that's what really makes a good pitch. And the funny thing is those are stories that are way easier to do. It's so hard to write a big story. It's so much easier to write a small story. And those are the stories that are actually more compelling. Those are the stories people will read. And it's funny, it doesn't even have to do with the fact that it's local. It's not just people in Paris that are reading about these volunteers. I found that on my own. It came into my feed. I think because the algorithms, the Google algorithms, don't show that I care about my local area more than Paris. It shows that I care about stories about people doing these kinds of things. And so the algorithm sends it to me. So the thing is, if you do a really small story, you could actually get a really big readership. It's counterintuitive. Any other questions? That was a great question, by the way. No? The other thing is, I talked about the challenge is once you do the pitch is doing the reporting. And there's a really interesting challenge to journalism. And let me just take down my thing. I think you have all captured this if you're going to capture this. The real challenge in my years and years of reporting, I've done thousands and thousands of interviews. The challenge is convincing the person who you have now identified as super interesting that they are actually interesting, and that the project you have identified as important, convincing the people who are doing this that what they are doing is important. Because we live in a world where people tend not to talk to each other, and their families don't really care about what they're doing. Their daughters don't care about what they're doing. Their spouses have gotten tired about what they're doing. And they're so used to people around them not really caring so much about what they're doing that they lose sight of the fact that to a total stranger, what they're doing is amazing, that their story is super interesting, and that their passion could be contagious. But you actually have to convince them that their story is worth telling, because we tend to think of our own story as a story not worth telling. And that's the power of journalism and the power of journalists, is that we look at people and we say, no, actually, you're quite valid. What you are doing is valid, and what you're doing is important, and we would like to share it with the world. And if you can do that, you've got the people, you've got their time, and you've got their cooperation, and you will have their passion and emotion in the story. And the last thing that I've left out of the presentation is what makes a good story: passion and emotion. They will tell you in journalism classes that what makes a good story is conflict. And that used to be the case. And that still, if you've got two bickering sides and they're both crazy, you could write a good story on that. But I think we live in a world where our climate problems are so pressing that we're not looking to be entertained by stories anymore. We're looking for hope. We're looking for inspiration, and we're looking for direction. And that's why stories about people who are starting to do that are giving us some kind of lesson plans on how we all can do that. You know, as I said, I've been largely avoiding meat now for 2 years, and it was because of one story I read about the impact of beef And when I read that story, I said to myself, I personally cannot rationalize eating meat anymore. And I ended up turning my sister and my spouse also. So there's three of us. Three of us stopped eating meat because of one story. And that's the power of stories. You can get people with one story to launch a pocket forest program of their own in their town. You know, you can get people to launch an organic food program in their town. Now, you won't do that on big stories. You will only do that on small stories when people have a clear idea of, oh, yes, that's achievable. Oh, yes, I can do that. Any other? Hit me with another question. How are we doing on time? We got a little bit of time.
I had a question. I was wondering if you talked a little bit about the process of creating a story. Are there any nuances to climate reporting that might differ from other types of stories?
Yes, it's the same with science reporting, and this is a problem we have with a lot of science reporting is that the people who are doing the reporting have a really good knowledge of science, and they cannot visualize people like me who are a little bit of ignoramuses and did not do well in science in school. And so you have to step away, and a real challenge in climate stories is that you're going to be interviewing people who are really knowledgeable. But what you're interviewing them for are people who are not knowledgeable. And so I always say you have to get people to speak in the English language. And that's not English. It's the English language. It's the way people talk. And often people who don't, remember I said that the challenge is getting people you have to convince them that you're actually interested in the story. They're so used to only talking to people who are as knowledgeable as they are that they forget what it's like to talk to people who have no clue what they're talking about. So the really hard thing to do as a reporter is to bring people back to earth, because we're trying to be polite and we don't interrupt them. And sometimes we're intimidated by our lack of knowledge, but our lack of knowledge is actually power. Because you're telling a story for people who don't know. So you have to be a person who doesn't know, even if you've done your research, which you should do before you interview, so that you know what kind of questions to ask. But I always picture when I am interviewing the people I'm interviewing for. And for me, it's a student in 9th grade and a woman who speaks English as a second language. And I have added recently people who are mentally deficient. Because do you not want people who are mentally deficient to understand climate change? You do. And so it's about people bringing people to real basics. So as they start jabbering and start throwing out terminology, to say, excuse me, can you explain what that means? And are you saying this? And I have no clue what you just said. And I will actually say that in interviews. I would tell people, especially scientists or academics or people who are used to talking to highly educated people, I will say, excuse me, can you please say that in the English language? What does that even mean? Because I'm going back to that one of the first slides. What's the story about? It's about air and water, land, food, and animals. They're really basic things, you know? So as people are talking about pH balances, I don't know what they talk about, chemistry and atmospheric levels and dust particles, you just have to every once in a while say, well, wait, how does this affect the air? How does this affect the water I breathe? You know, and why should I even care about this? And if you can challenge people, again, it's counterintuitive. We think, oh, wow, that's being disrespectful. No, it's actually being super respectful, because what you are telling people is, I have actually listened to what you just said, and I don't understand it. And if you pretend to understand, you're giving people the sense that you're not actually listening. So the second you interrupt someone and you say, wait, let me stop you right there, because what you just said, I don't get. You have just said to them, I actually really want to understand what you're saying. And at that point, they perk up and their brain shifts into a different plane, because up until then, they might have been just going on automatic pilot, blah, 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 blah. Let me tell you about this and this and this and this and this and this, because they're used to giving presentations. They're used to standing in front of a group of people, whatever. And you have just shifted them into a thing where they have to start actually communicating their thoughts. And it makes it way more real. And what happens is a really interesting thing is that, first of all, as a reporter, you begin loving this process. It's a really great process, interviewing. But the person you are interviewing is really getting into it. Because again, we live in a world where no one listens to each other. No one. Families, sisters don't listen to each other. Spouses don't listen to each other. Bosses don't listen to their workers, and their workers are definitely not listening to their bosses. And you get into an interview and you are telling someone, you know what, I am going to totally listen to what you're saying. It's like therapy. People pay for this. So anything else? Give me another one. Does anyone have any, is anyone nervous about the reporting process? Do you like talking to people? Because I have to tell you, the funny thing is, I remember I said I did 2,000 interviews. I'm always nervous. I'm nervous right now. I actually do not like talking in front of people. I get very, very nervous. Yeah, you're in the fun. This is the thing. I think I've said twice or three times the word counterintuitive. Journalism is all counterintuitive. When you interview someone and you're nervous, you are nervous. The person you're interviewing is not nervous. The person you're interviewing is perfectly fine. The only thing they might be nervous about is wondering if you know what you're doing. Because if you don't know what you're doing, they're being asked to give themselves over to you. And you don't want to give someone information if you don't know they're capable of handling that information. So in the interviewing process, the important thing is to convey the idea that you know what you're doing. And often we just have to fake that. It's the one fake thing that you want to do in journalism. Nothing else should be fake, but the confidence is often faked. But you only need it for the first moment. There's like a line you have to cross. Here's you, here's your person, and there's this dividing line. It's like the Rubicon line, and you have to cross that. And that's the moment of nerve-wrackingness. But once you cross over that, once you introduce yourself, once you say, hi, I'm Marcy Burstiner, I'm doing a story, or we talked on the phone and I'm doing a story on people who are trying to solve climate change, and that's why I found you, and can you tell me a little bit about yourself? Once that happens, that's it. You don't have to worry about it. You won't be nervous after that. It's just that one line you have to cross. So you always just have to take a deep breath and say, okay, I can do this. And I have to tell you, I do that every time I do an interview. I've done thousands of interviews. I've always had to just sit there before I pick up the phone and say, I can do this. Because I'm the one that's nervous. They're not nervous. They'll be nervous if you're nervous. Nervousness is contagious. So you just have to, and a lot of it is just getting into a format and just saying, like I just said, I'm Marcy Burstiner, this is what I'm doing. How are you?
Marcy, if I could follow up on that, what are some of the best questions? Well, they're the questions that you think are great when you're doing your research, but then they're the questions your interviewees really love to answer. So what were the best questions that people got really into?
It's so basic. It's how and why. So you start out with something really simple, like, tell me what you're doing right now, or tell me a little bit about your project. Or let's say I was doing that pocket forest things, and I say, well, what do you guys even really do? And they'll say, oh, well, we've been planting trees. I said, well, what kinds of trees? So it's the specifics. And the ones that get the best answers, though, are, well, why are you doing this? The why. How does that work? The best questions are questions people can answer, which sounds funny, but I've been interviewed several times. And I remember being interviewed by a student once, and I can't remember the question. I wish I had written the question down, but it stumped me. I was just on the other end of the line, and she said, hello. I said, wait, I'm just sorry. I can't answer that question. And the problem is I'm fine being interviewed because I know what it's like. But for someone else who is never interviewed, if you hit them with a question they can't answer, they feel stupid. And that's when it goes south. You don't want people to feel stupid. So you don't want to ask them questions that they're not primed to answer. So for instance, if you're interviewing an engineer, they're all about how things work, but they might not be so big on the philosophical. If you're interviewing a business person, they're all about money. I worked for a law journal for a while, interviewing business lawyers, and a lot of people would make the mistake of talking to these lawyers and trying to talk to them about law. But what really interests lawyers is money. And if you talk about money, you just got them, because that's actually their language. Their language is not law. Their language is money. And so it's asking people questions that you pretty much know they can answer. Oh, the other thing is there's this myth from movies that in journalism, it's all about getting people to give you information they don't want to give you. And that's almost never the case. It's what you want to do is find people who have information they really want to give you. And so I simplify that and I say, why talk to someone who's a jerk when you can talk to someone who's nice? Why talk to someone who doesn't want to talk to you when you could talk to someone who really wants to talk to you? And how many people are there in the world? There's like 7 billion people in the world. In Paris, if you want a lawyer, how many lawyers are there in Paris? There's like hundreds of them. How many environmental activists are there? There's lots and lots of them. So we don't need to go find someone who doesn't want to be found. We want to find someone whose story really should be told. They know their story really should be told, and no one has bothered to talk to them before. Those are the people. Those are the really, really great stories. And those are really fun interviews to do. And ultimately, reporting should be a really fun thing. It shouldn't be a slog. If it's a slog, your story is boring, and your person is boring. And you want to move on and find someone more interesting. Any other questions? Although in general, I do believe that everyone is interesting. I do. And I think that if you are actually in the middle of an interview and you're thinking this person is really boring, you're asking the wrong questions. You haven't gotten to what they're passionate about. If you can just get to what they're passionate about, then it works. Sometimes you have to break away and ask them something completely different. Like, do you have any pets? Because if someone has dogs, they're really passionate about their dogs. And once they start talking about their dogs, you've got them and you can ask them anything. Some people just close up and you just have to open them up. And curiosity is the key. Just being really, really curious about people. You have to be very nosy. We're told from the time we're little to mind our own business, and we're told that not to be impertinent. And for a really good interview, you have to be really nosy, and you have to be pretty impertinent. That's my two skills in life. I'm very nosy, and I have always been quite impertinent. But if you're not impertinent, by the way, I have known reporters who are amazingly effective simply by being nice. That's not my thing. I'm nice isn't my effective, my superpower. My superpower is being impertinent. But I did have a reporter once who got the most amazing interviews because she was so nice that no one could ever say no to her. She was dangerously nice. And so nice can work. So don't think you have to be mean. Any other questions? We have a quiet crowd now. No? Do you, how many of you are teachers? Are any of you teachers? You could just give me a little hand if you're a teacher. No, okay. Okay, so I'm assuming that you are people who are actually interested in doing the reporting yourself. Good. The final thing to know is that publications are always looking for these kinds of stories. You know, they're always looking, you know, in journalism classes, I always tell students that if you want to sell a story, write a profile. Because everyone wants to know about interesting people around them. Okay. Well, we could, unless we have, you train children in news reporting. Good. You know, the best experience I ever had teaching was I volunteered to start a little newspaper at my daughter's elementary school for their 5th grade class. And the students there, these 5th graders, which they must have been 10 years old, were amazing reporters. Children have a natural ability to ask questions until we keep telling them to stop asking questions. But they were brilliant. Good.
I'm going to share in the chat News Decoder. As I mentioned at the start, we work with schools all around the world. So if you are a teacher and you're interested in learning more about how we might work with your students, please visit our site. But we also have a number of resources just available on our site and thousands of news stories that are geared towards a youth audience. And we do have a pitch form. So if you have story ideas, your students have story ideas, we'd love to hear it and maybe work with you to help with your reporting, putting together interviews, or even getting published on our site. So I'm going to drop that link in the chat.
Yeah. Young people are really good at finding stories because, again, no one has told them that, you know, I used to talk about in newsrooms, the 3 horrible words you don't want to hear as a journalist is what else you got. So you give your editor an idea, you're like, oh, there's a great story. And they look at you and they say, well, what else you got? And you're like, oh, because you're like, no, that was a really good story. But kids, they just have a way of spotting interesting things. Okay, good. There will be a recording and we can wrap this up. And it has been great. Excellent. Good. I hope you have something you could take with you. And we would love to hear back from you if anything you've taken from this you've used and you've got students or you are writing a story. That would be really exciting.